Welcome to the latest of my deep dive videos. Today I'm going to explore the planet of action, drive and passion, Mars, going direct in the sensitive sign of Cancer, where it's been retrograde since the 6th of January. But Mars actually moved into Cancer first of all on the 4th of September. And in total, through its entire journey, which we'll see it leave Cancer and return back into the sign of Leo on the 18th of April. From that point on the 4th of September, Mars will have been in Cancer for 23 weeks. That's a huge amount of time for a hostile planet, because Mars, of course, is the lesser malefic, but it's located in a sign which it's not comfortable in. It's in its full in Cancer, but the sign of Cancer is ruled by the moon. The moon's very much what Mars isn't. It's about nurture, sensitivity, can be to do with protectiveness, and those energies are very much the themes of the sign of Cancer itself. But Mars's impatience and potentially its intolerance, but also its potential to be rather triggered, has certainly been to the fore since the 6th of January. But what I want to show you is what the event chart said when Mars moved into Cancer on the 4th of September. Because the incredible thing was, at that point, Mars was in conflict with the moon. And as Mars leaves the retrograde on the 24th, based on universal, Mars is in conflict with the moon. Isn't that quite incredible in terms of the synchronicity? But also, we need to be mindful of some of the things that have happened since Mars went into its retrograde. Not least, the big fire in California started on the 7th of January, incredibly, because obviously Mars can be about fire because it rules the fire sign of Aries, but also it can be an incendiary influence, very much to do with arson potentially, but also war, military maneuvers, terrorist attacks, industrial disputes, conflicts, opposition forces, and strangely, the fire service. So just as Mars is about to go direct, the head of the LA fire service, I understand, has been dismissed. Isn't it interesting how this is all playing out? Also, the sign of Cancer, very much about land. We got a lot of conversation and dialogue going on at the moment about land, but whose land, and how is that dialogue being handled? Is it being handled in a courteous, fair and proportionate way, or are we seeing some of the more negative energies of Mars being applied by using a degree of coercion and force, but emotionality, to make simple points that don't take into account the facts? I'm going to also share with you the event chart as Mars goes direct, both from a solar but also natal perspective. The solar perspective just helps us to see the big picture collectively, but the natal is fascinating in terms of the two houses concerned, because we're seeing a second 8th house opposition. That's all about resources, money. And it can, in terms of the 8th house, be about things which are not obvious, so things that are beneath the ground, things that will be mined. So I'm going to go through all of this for you, then I'm going to give you a flavour of what you can expect for your zodiac sign through to the 18th of April, when Mars returns back into the fire sign of Leo, where it will be a lot happier for sure, but just be aware Mars doesn't emerge from its post-retrograde shadow until the 5th of May. So the big question, does Mars going direct ease the tension? In my view, no. It changes things to a degree, and we could see a more defended attitude come in, rather than a more reactive attitude to some of the clear bullying that has been played out. We could see a much more constructive pushback, but there is going to be a big battle of wills, because the sign of Cancer is a cardinal sign and it can be controlling. Every sign, every planet has its polarities. its very good qualities and its much more negative qualities. So if we're trying to control something, particularly linked to land, which can be very much to do with the moon, and that is in some ways interfering in another person's ownership of that land, that's where Mars is being used in a malicious and pernicious way. And that is what the astrology is going to share with you. I'll then go through each of those 12 signs for you to give you a flavour of what to expect. I'm astrologer Patrick Arundell. If you're new here, it's great to have your company. Please help the channel to thrive by clicking that sub button, but also the bell notification symbol. I do a lot of one-to-ones. It's my main job. I am a consulting astrologer. Please check out my testimonials below if you'd like to speak to me directly. I've also got a new service. You can have a video reading. You don't speak to me directly, but I send it to you. And that gives people an opportunity for me to look into their astrology in a deeper way. Or you can go for my written reports, which are fantastic value. And if you order them before the end of February, you'll get them half price. This is to celebrate my new website. Please do check it out at www.patrickarundell.com. It's really coming together. There's lots of new exciting features, but also you can grab your free 3-card tarot. And you know, it's a brilliant three-card tarot, but also lots of other celestial goodies. So first of all, I wanted to share with you when Mars moved into Cancer on the 4th of September. And you can see it's actually in the 3rd house, based on universal and the prime meridian. And the 3rd house is very much about ideas, but it's also about communication. We know that Mars in Cancer can be very deeply emotional, and therefore that can compromise logic. But having Mars in the 3rd house certainly gives a lot of thrust to anyone who can present an argument with a great deal of conviction, but most of all force. But look at the position of the moon. The moon's in the fair-minded sign of Libra, also a cardinal sign, but it's an exact square. So in terms of the nativity, from a Placidus viewpoint, we've got a 3rd, 6th house energy. The moon's receptive, caring, nurturing, sensitive. Mars is impatient. It wants its win straight away. They're not on good terms. Right from the off, there is tension, and that tension has been palpable since Mars moved into Cancer in September. Now, as you know, Mars then made its way into Leo in the early part of November, but then went into a retrograde in that sign on the 6th of December. But Mars is still way happier in Leo because, of course, Leo, the 3rd decan, is sub-ruled by Mars. So there is a natural mutuality between Mars and its rulership of the 1st zodiac sign of Aries. So a very fiery combination. But we also need to be mindful that Mars does rule the sign of Scorpio too, which is a water sign. So there is some mutual receptivity in that sense with Mars in Cancer. But I'm going to share with you some strands that I feel is very much about Mars being in Cancer. I think it creates a high amount of intensity around emotion. But because Mars can be so impatient and direct and wants to gain its assertion quickly and directly, it can create a lot of impatience. And when we are approaching things that are very sensitive and we take that very impatient line, that can create a lot of resistance, but also creates a lot of trouble. And so it can see a lot of moodiness, a lot of irritability, and there can be arguments and there can be disagreements. Now, whether that's with people that we know intimately within the family, or we have an argument with an estate agent or a builder over a property, well, you can see where the link would be. But because of the instinctive nature of Cancer is to be very protective, the more reactive energy of Mars can mean to create that protectiveness, the response can be very triggered and very quick. But that's not always the greatest way to deal with issues. The other complex thing about Mars being in Cancer is that the sign of Cancer can actually be very resistant to outright conflict, and the crab will scuttle left, scuttle right, do anything to avoid an outright conflict because it's very protective. But Cancer is actually, being the cardinal sign it is, a very strong sign and has great internal resources. But it's important to understand when the excess of energy has come up that we're not projecting that onto people around us who perhaps aren't doing things quite as quickly or in the way we want. So if you have been experiencing in your personal situation these kind of energies, it wouldn't be a complete surprise. But the sign of Cancer is also in mundane astrology very much about land, and it can in some ways be to do when it's in an opposition to energies in the 10th house, the sign of Capricorn. That can see the people's needs come into conflict with the governmental position. So we are seeing quite a lot going on in the world where not every citizen is particularly happy with the way their government is running the business. But because of the complexity of Mars in its retrograde, I feel that the reactive triggering energies has brought out a horrible desire to dominate in an overly controlling, passive-aggressive and very angry, getting one's spite out first way. And the problem with that is that it has actually diminuted the more gentle and more positive attributes of Cancer, which is about trying to protect and maintain a degree of security. So whether it's about our feelings or whether it's about our homes, that is something that we do feel very strongly about. It made me think very carefully about some of the things that are being very much in the public eye at the moment. So the whole equalities debate, especially to do with trans, if we think about sexuality in terms of male being masculine, moon being feminine, Mars being in Cancer has been a time when there seems to be a big pushback against a lot of these strands. Now, it's not necessarily that people are outright intolerant. I think it's more that they're outright fed up of being imposed upon by a minority in a way which just seems ridiculously politically correct. So there will be, for some people, a sense of validation that there is a change of tone, that things are being manifested in a more masculine way. So that is something we could consider too. But let's also think that Mars represents fire. It also represents, of course, arson, incendiarism, inflammation. If you have been suffering a lot with any fevers, chills, temperatures, colds, flus, COVID, whatever, since Mars moved into Cancer, it really wouldn't be a surprise. Now, I know that people who don't really get astrology would just say, well, it's the winter in the north, people are going to get those things. But just be aware that we have had the big fire in California. What day did that start on? It was on the 7th of January, the day after Mars went retrograde in the sign of Cancer, and the sign of Cancer rules land. And also the fire services, who fought so gallantly to control the flames, were competing with other people who seemed to be willfully lighting those fires. Who did that? We know that you do get copycat behaviour, but who were the original people? Was it true that some of the infrastructure had been wound down? Was there cuts to the fire service? Who will eventually get the blame? Oh, guess what? The leader of the fire service was sacked yesterday. So again, a very aggressive, assertive response to something that may be a lot more complex. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is about the situation in the Ukraine. Now, I think those people who follow my videos know that I try to stay very neutral where possible, apart from Putin. But in 1994, we did have the Budapest Memorandum, and the United States of America and Russia and also Great Britain signed an accordance with Ukraine that maintained their sovereignty to their land, but it also said that no one had the right to use economic coercion in order to subordinate their own interest and exercise over Ukraine the rights of their sovereignty. When we have land being discussed and force impatiently being implied, well, actually the security agreement that was forged at that time was when Ukraine gave up their nuclear arsenal. So in fact what we've got in a purely logical, factual way is the United States and Russia have gone back on the agreement that was signed. So Russia invaded and the United States is now making their support conditional. That's a fact. That's not me taking sides. And that could be, I feel, the impatience of Mars to try to resolve the war. We all want the war to stop. And I feel that President Trump will probably be successful in stopping this war quicker than it would have stopped without his intervention. But here's my prediction. I think the war will start again. And unfortunately, I feel that the role of Russia will become ever more malevolent, future forwards for us all. And so that's my prediction on it. But I do think he will be successful. But we have to understand that some of the treaties that were signed are being reneged upon. And yet the president of the Ukraine is being incredibly unfairly castigated as trying to stop some kind of process to create peace. Another comment that's been made, which is again the passive aggressive Mars in Cancer, is that the Ukrainian leader had 3 years to come to the table to stop the war. The Ukrainians went to the table from 2014 with the Russians 220 times. It didn't stop the Russians invading. Also, it was made clear to the Russians that Ukraine wasn't going to get into NATO. Do you know what this was about? It was about resources. And isn't it incredible when we dissolve it all down that actually that's what's really being battled over now. Who gets those resources? So I'm sharing on the screen now the event chart from a solar perspective of Mars going direct, just to keep it simple. And you can see Mars in the 4th house in Cancer, as it would be. But look at the moon in the 10th house of government, if you like. But also the moon is in its detriment in the sign of Capricorn. So the moon here can be very businesslike, but lack emotional empathy and insight, to be honest. And particularly because Mars and the moon are in a direct opposition. That's where we're seeing this leverage, this coercion, which is very, very unpleasant. And it seems to me is not good for our whole spiritual connection to one another. That's not me being some woolly-eyed hippie. I'm actually incredibly middle of the road, but it just doesn't feel very good. When someone has been bullied and an enormous amount of their land has been stolen and the aggressor will be rewarded with that, that doesn't feel good, does it? So you can see how Mars in the sign of Cancer, despite its retrograde going direct, because of that opposition with Mars, it's not going to be a panacea. You can also see that Mercury is in a very strong link with Mars. It's in a trine. So that can see a lot of effective communication, certainly a lot of passionate communication, because they're both in water signs. But Mercury's not happy. It's even more detrimented than Mars in Cancer. Of course, it's in its fall as well as being detrimented, but it's very close to Saturn. And Saturn, I feel, is a lot to do with some of the more sinister energies that are being played out at this time. So be aware that there's going to be a big push. There's going to be more abuse exchanged because it's all been very personal. The vitriol that's been expressed has been extremely unpleasant, very unstatesmanlike. Not even the Russians talk about their enemies in such a flagrantly abusive way. It is really hard to swallow. So Mercury, the planet of communication, being close to Saturn, we could find over the next few days that there's even more pushing and even more kind of use of psychological warfare and particularly briefing and different people providing different opinions. Who controls the media these days? I've been saying this for about 5 years, that democracy is eating itself alive. And with Saturn and Jupiter in their ground square since the middle of July last year until a few weeks ago, what we've seen is the exaggeration of Jupiter, which can be about dogma, in the sign of Gemini, which can be about not necessarily being particularly truthful, and Saturn in the sign of Pisces, which is to do with accumulative energies. But again, Saturn, not a great place to be, because Saturn likes structures, and the sign of Pisces can wash them away. So we're seeing this whole security construct that's existed for a long time being washed away on the base of force. Now, pardon me, now I'm sharing with you the event chart from a natal perspective, and there it is. Mars in the 8th house of mining, long-term finance. But Mars in the 8th house brings out that more scorpionic energy, which can be very coercive, can be very possessive, but it can be downright bullying. And there is the moon in the 2nd house, about protecting our everyday interest and money. Just another takeout for you. There seems to be a lot of, from what I don't usually comment on American politics per se, because I don't feel that I'm really have the right to do so. But it does seem that there seems to be a lot of dismantling of the governmental infrastructure. Most citizens, if you say to them, does government burn up too much money? Is it never monitored and audited enough? We'd all say, yeah, they all consume far too much money and they all have a very easy time of it. But just be aware that Mars is also squaring up with Chiron as it goes direct. So an aggressive force against health issues or health provisions, or perhaps social provisions as well. That's all playing out too, I feel. So what we're seeing is apparently a lot of assertive language, but actually I feel a lot of it is to do with insecurity and control. And the sign of Cancer, that's its weak point. It can be controlling, but usually Cancers will do it in a non-verbal or non-aggressive way. For example, they will just remove themselves from a situation that is uncomfortable, and sometimes that in itself is a very passive-aggressive thing to do, because you're not actually taking the issue forwards and having a clear-the-air discussion. So one of the things you could say that's very laudable is that obviously Trump wants to get a resolution, but we have to understand what the motive is, and we have to understand that a nation state should have the final say over its land, its resources, its borders, and the people who signed up the documents to protect them when they gave up nuclear weapons should keep to those commitments, which they're clearly not doing. So that's my little take on it. But as I say, I don't really take sides. I can see that Trump does get things done, and you know, his force of will and his energy is incredible. It really is. So I'm going to go through each of the 12 zodiac signs from Aries through to Pisces to give you a flavour of what to expect through to the 18th of April. Thank you. So Aries, for you, as Mars goes direct, you might feel a bit of a change in the frequency of the frustration or delays that you've been experiencing, but you still need to dig in and expect that a degree of control over the things that aren't going quite as fast as you want may be needed through to the 18th of April. Now, on the 18th of April, you're really going to enjoy Mars returning to Leo for sure, and of course at the end of March you're going to benefit from a glorious solar eclipse in your sign, and also Neptune's moving into your sign at the end of March too. So there is going to be some very positive energy coming through. But until then, if there is something that you're winding down in your life with all this Pisces energy, it wouldn't be a surprise. If it is anything to do with separations from an old career, from a friendship group, from one particular person that you've been mates with for years, whether it is in a romantic dimension, whether it's to do with your work, if something's winding down in your life and you're yet to see the new beginning really shape up in quite the way that you would like, that could be the energies that you're confronted with at the present time. So if you have been finding yourself feeling quite irritable or even feeling a bit helpless, if you haven't felt that things have been going in the way that you need, and there has been a sense of huge inertia, in a way that's possible. But if you have been able to use any excess energy you've had to do some practical things like, reorganize your home, bang up some shelves, declutter, perhaps if you want to move, redecorate, put it on the market, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere with the brighter weather coming, that would be a great time to do so. But if there are tensions in your family life, or someone's not been very supportive or understanding of some of the psychological strains that all those energies in Pisces are creating, you could find yourself feeling rather disappointed at that lack of support, because the sign of Cancer is about nurture. It is about that support. But just know that with that solar eclipse coming, Neptune arriving in your sign, and Mars going back to Leo on the 18th of April, that a lot of excitement is upcoming, and it's about just being very philosophical that some parts of your life may just be ending, to let them go, and know that Pluto in your 11th house is helping you to formulate your exciting future, your long-term future, even if the pathway to it isn't crystal clear at the present time. So Taurus, you have a reputation of being very, very patient and can be very placid until things really well up and you feel that people are not respecting the way that you go about things, your systematic and reliable approach. So you may have found yourself being a lot more outspoken since the 6th of January. You could have also considered buying a new mode of transport, and you may even have stepped up your exercise regime to be much more physically active. But within all those potential positives, there could have been some huge frustrations. Are they going to go away? Well, I feel the main thing to consider really is that your ruler Venus, as this event occurs, is locked away in your 12th house, which is very psychological. So whatever it is you're thinking about, whether it is work, whether it is technology, whether it is learning or teaching things, whether it is travel, just be conscious of what might be informing some of your decisions. Because if you are unhappy, for example, in a relationship, the chances are that you've been a lot more assertive, and you've been saying how you feel in a much more direct way. And that may be a very positive thing, particularly if someone has been a little bit taking you for granted. So if you found your voice, that's great, but you do need to use that voice through to the 18th of April in a very astute way. And that means marshalling that part of your nature that once you're riled can be hugely like the proverbial bull in the china shop. But I think it does take a lot for you to get to that degree of frustration, but it can still be there. So just be conscious of that. But if you have felt that some news or a contract or something you've been working on that you feel very enthusiastic about has not really gained the traction you want, I do think it can improve from here on in through to the 18th of April. So Gemini, Mars entered your sign for the last 10 days of July 2024, sparking a lot of energy and propulsion, excitement, a very dynamic influence. And that may have seen you gain traction around certain plans, And then when Mars moved into Cancer on the 4th of September, things could have been shaping up famously. It's just that Jupiter in your sign has been clashing with Saturn in your worldly sector. And Jupiter in your sign may have given you a greater sense of positivity and hope, but the reality may have created some delays. Now, once Mars moved into Leo, again, you're on the front foot. You felt that things were gathering speed. But then with Mars's retrograde from the 6th of December and then Mars inverting back into Cancer on the 6th of January, you may feel that one of your targets that you set your sights on last summer in the north, last winter in the south, has just seemed frustratingly out of reach. Just be aware that as Mars goes direct, your ruler Mercury is very close to Saturn. The language you choose and the way you connect to the wider world is going to be very important for you to convert that idea that you generated into something more tangible. This is a time now to be as patient as possible. And because the moon's on the other side of the heavens in house 8, if it's anything to do with a negotiation or shared resources or working with a partner on a situation, if you try to dominate the situation because of Saturn being in your 10th house, you may get a kind of stilted response. So the best thing I could say to you until Mars returns to your 3rd house on the 18th of April is just take a breath and relax. Just keep going through the processes of whatever it is you're excited about, and eventually you will get the outcome you seek. For Cancer, if you have any planetary positions from 29 degrees and whatever minutes in Cancer through to about 15, you will have been affected by this retrograde. And the retrograde itself is going to be slow to unravel. Mars doesn't really step forwards even to 1 degree until the 10th of March. It's going to be stumbling along at 17 degrees and some minutes. So if you have something around there, you're not necessarily going to see an instant switch in dynamic. But don't underestimate, and I'm always saying this, just what a leader you can be. And a lot of people, whether it's leading the family, managing resources, a business, a department, perhaps even your own organisation, Cancer people can often be extremely effective managers of resources and people because you can squeeze the most out of assets. You have a very step-by-step way of tuning into things instinctively, but then making sure that things have that daily shape to them that gives it some kind of identity that people can relate to. But you may have found, if you have got those degrees, that, and even if you've got any degrees in Cancer since Mars went into Cancer, you may have found yourself much more triggered and outspoken than is usually the case. If you have found yourself in some outright confrontations that you've not really experienced very much in the past, this is why. Mars in your own sign brings a sense of instinctive need to fight back and really push back if anyone's being unreasonable or unfair. So just be aware that although things can ease with Mars going direct, because the moon is in your opposite sign in detriment as this event happens, if you do have planets right at the heart of Cancer, I feel that the potential for someone to be a bit mean, bullying, unreasonable to you is still there, and you will need to garner all of your patience and resilience, one of your greatest qualities, through to the 18th of April when Mars emerges back into the sign of Leo. But if you're working on anything that's remotely creative, it's going to be the 18th of April when you're going to start to see just how much you have put in place and what you can truly manifest. So Leo, for you, I feel that this Mars retrograde in Cancer has been particularly complex. In fact, I feel that the complexity started before even the retrograde, so it was from the 4th of September. Now, early in November, you got some relief because Mars moved out of your 12th house into your sign. But Mars in the 12th house has an incredible ability to trigger old subconscious hurts and past pains. Anything where we feel that there's been an injustice, for example, or a betrayal. The 12th house can be secret enemies. And all of that stuff may have been washing around, certainly from the early part of September to the early part of December. And then, of course, Mars was retrograde in the sign of your own sign of Leo. And even if you felt that you were getting some kind of traction going, once Mars inverted back into Cancer, I feel that you may have found yourself quite introspective at times, or finding that your emotions have been extremely unlike you. You're very conscious of how people might view you, but with people that you're intimate with, you may have been at times very angry and at other times very emotional. And you could have also found yourself thinking about situations from the past where perhaps you didn't have the time or space to really let your emotions go. Those emotions may have been much more vivid, to the fore, and really quite visceral. So with Mars going direct, there's still the potential for that energy, unfortunately, particularly with the moon in your 6th solar house, which is very much to do with the details. So at work, especially if you're working in an environment which is quite toxic, or people are not very honest, or there is backbiting and bitching and people are always plotting, that's not going to be an environment that's going to be easy for you to manage. So if you do have options to transfer to a more peaceful, more constructive environment, I really would think very carefully about seizing them. So Virgo, this whole Mars in Cancer initially, then Leo, then the retrograde Leo, then the retrograde in Cancer. It's particularly fascinating for your sign. Initially, when Mars moved into your 11th house, it kind of pushed you to perhaps connect more with people, socially perhaps, maybe around shared ideals. Maybe you started to think more about your long-term plan. But once Mars moved forwards and went into your 12th house, that was potentially quite challenging from the early part of November through to the 6th of January in the sign of Leo. And you may have found that your own moods and emotions and responses were quite up and down. But then Mars going into retrograde in your 11th house may have seen you asking yourself some serious questions about your long-term hopes, your future, but also your friendships, your alliances, your allegiances may all have come very strongly under the astral microscope. So there could have been some friction with certain people that in the past may have been a core part of your friendship group. It's also possible that you may have had an about turn in terms of your long-term plan. You may have found yourself wanting to take more of a lead, or break away from something and be much more individualistic, because that's what 11th house energy is like. Essentially, Mars, since the 6th of January, has been in an Aquarius phase for you, even though the host is very emotional, is Cancer, but the 11th house, kind of Aquarius values. So if your values in any way have encountered someone who doesn't necessarily have the highest of virtue in their approach, that could have been very triggering for you because of the emotionality of Cancer. I feel it's going to get easier now to think about what you want from your future, but whether you're going to actually make it happen just yet, I am not sure. And that's because of Mars returning to your 12th house. So mark this in your diary: from the 17th of June 2025, Mars will arrive in your sign. But from now until then, I do think you're going to be doing quite a lot of soul searching, and the soul searching could also be in relation to a close partnership, perhaps even a love bond. If there is some tensions there, you may be a little bit up and down through to the middle of June about what you should really do. So Libra, Mars being in Cancer initially for you from the 4th of September through to the early parts of November, gave you a lot of desire to heighten your profile, be more assertive, take a leading role, perhaps at times be even more dominated in situations where perhaps in the past you may have felt that you've been a bit too giving, a bit too obliging. All that energy in the sign of Pisces has been checked in a way by the more ruthless, cold vision of Saturn. So because Neptune has been so giving, or you've been so given since 2012 in certain situations, Saturn's been making you a lot more steely-eyed. But because the sixth house can be about the detail or the practical structure of our work, but the 10th house can be about our ambition, you may have found yourself during that period really wanting to reach for the stars, and why not? And then, of course, Mars moved into your 11th house. So if you took your ambition into some kind of collaboration, that may have given you more traction until the 6th of December. And you may have found from then, really round to now, that something that's very important to you may have felt like it's been treading water. And of course, Cancer is a water sign. The collective we have in Pisces is a water sign. Because you're a very rational sign, air, and because you weigh things up in a very logical way, all that water may have been a little draining to the vitality that you've had to really push forwards with the big hopes that you have. But dust yourself down. It's still a complex time, there's no doubt about it, particularly with the moon opposing Mars as it goes direct in your 4th house, reminding you of the importance of staying in touch with how you feel, whatever your ambitions, goals may be. But if you have got something that you want to drive forwards and achieve some greater recognition, greater respect and authority through to the 18th of April, you can do it. You've just got to be aware that the details of things are very important, but also you need to make sure that you're ultra organized in the way that you're delivering your talents, your flair, and your brilliance to the wider world. So Scorpio, for you, Mars is also your traditional ruler. So it's been in your 9th house since the 4th of September through to early November. That may have been a time when in some way or another you broke out, particularly while Pluto was still in Capricorn through to the 19th of November. But since then, as Pluto moved into Aquarius for that long haul through to 243 initially, and then, of course, we've had Mars move into the top of your chart, giving you a push to be much more strident, really, and much more in the mode to achieve greater recognition. If you're someone who is quite comfortable taking on roles of seniority or authority, no problem. But then, of course, Mars went retrograde 6th of December. So some kind of professional situation may have really slowed right down, not really given you what you wanted. And then since the 6th of January round to now, that desire to be more adventurous and widen your horizons and shake things up has had to coexist with that Pluto energy, which is asking you to become much more conscious of your emotions. So that quincunx is really quite hard to balance. So Mars going direct, we'll take it all day long for your sign. I have a lot of Scorpio too. And it is going to release some tension and steam that you may have been experiencing if things have been slow. But if you are working through anything of a contractual nature, or you are trying to relocate, or your work is linked to travel, some of the things that have really blighted you since the turn of the year can definitely get easier. But if you are working on something which is still requiring a little bit more research and preparation, you're really going to receive the limelight in a big way from the 18th of April. Sagittarius, when Mars moved into Cancer, first of all, from the 4th of September, that may have heightened your passion. Let's think of Mars in terms of its connection to Scorpio, because that's 8th house energy. People don't see you as someone who might get particularly worked up about ownership and control. We all have a need to control our own lives. That's a natural thing. And of course, you are someone who is a free spirit. But because of the energy that has been in Pisces, is very much about home. and possibly about property. If you have been trying to transact anything around a move, whether it's around a lease or a purchase or a rental, it may have been somewhat complex, because once Mars moved into Leo, your naturally connected fire sign, that may have excited you, but then there may have been some details that have bogged things down, particularly if you're someone who is very keen on moving around very freely in the world. So finding the balance between nurture that the Piscean energy is asking of you and the more dashing energy of Mars when it was in Leo, very tricky. But over these weeks since the 6th of January, Mars in its retrograde in the 8th house, if you've been waiting for money to come through on some kind of legacy or inheritance, you've been working on some kind of financial planning, pensions, savings, shares, investments, cryptocurrencies, whatever it is, you may not have seen things moving as you wish. And that could have created some tensions, particularly if there's someone else involved in the equation, because the 8th house can be where we're devoted and deeply invested, as much as the more the hard and fast financial potential. Things can ease, things can speed up. That part of you that does like to do your own thing is going to come much more to the fore from the 18th of April through to the middle of June. And then that's going to be a time when you could see the payoff for the hard work or diligence you've been showing, even if it feels that things are going at the speed of, well, nothing. Just know that the result is coming for you from the middle of June when it comes to a key ambition. So Capricorn, ever since Mars moved into your 7th house on the 4th of September last year, you may have found yourself involved in some potentially heavy stuff when it comes to relationships. The reason for this is Mars is about assertion. Now, you can have a situation, or we can have situations where we do need to stand up for our rights and push back on someone who may be unfair and trying to assert their will in an unjust manner. And in that situation, or where you've had to be particularly competitive or vigilant, perhaps through your work, taking on a rival or someone who works in your business who's not necessarily got the best approach, it's good to have Mars protective in that way. But Mars on the 7th house cusp in relationship charts can cause some problems because it can be so hostile. And once Mars then went into the sign of Leo, for you, that's house 8. So that's where we're really getting in to a much deeper, more invested situation, can be much more sexual when it comes to intimacy. That's Mars for its more scorpionic energies. And then, of course, it went into retrograde and then it's inverted back into the sign of Cancer. So if you met someone in the autumn, the fall in the north, or in the spring in the south, and that relationship got hot and heavy quite quickly, but then has become quite complex in terms of feeling heard, seen, respected, it wouldn't be a complete surprise. But the relationship could be to do with your work as much as to do with a personal consideration. Or it may be that someone close to you, you feel, has been taking liberties. But because your ruler Saturn has been in your 3rd house for a couple of years, there may have been times when you found it more difficult to say how you feel. You may have just experienced a somewhat of an inhibition. But I think on this event, because Mercury is forging such a constructive link to Mars, if you do need to speak out, you can. The moon being in your own sign, although Mars is trying to dominate it, it's also helping you to stay in touch with what you truly want. But if there is some kind of awkward politics going on with someone that you live with, within your family, within your network, the important thing to understand is Mars in the 7th house is something that has to be used proportionately. Otherwise, people may feel that you're reacting to a situation in far too much of a feisty way, but you might not see it like that. But just be aware that that can be the impression that's created. But there's another thing about Mars being in the 7th house, Capricorn. If all that history of the last few months doesn't seem to apply to you, Mars in the 7th house could see you through to the middle of April being much more proactive about connecting with others. Could be socially, could be business-wise, could be romantically. And now you're more conscious of how Mars has worked out for you in terms of thinking about your boundaries, what you've got to offer, but also clarifying what your manifesto is for what you want from someone else. This whole retrograde process has taught you a lot, whether you've been seeing someone or not, and now you could be good to go and actually have the drive and enthusiasm to make some new connections sparkle. So Aquarius, when Mars first made its way into the sign of Cancer from the 4th of September through to early November, I feel that you could have found yourself feeling a lot more proactive, a lot more productive. You may have even found yourself a little bit more inclined to exercise, be a bit more mindful of what you were eating or drinking. But then Mars moved into your sector of relating and then went into the retrograde in that sector from the 6th of December through to the 6th of January. That could have been a time when there were definite tensions around some relationships. Now that Mars is going direct, if there has been something that you've been trying to transact, which requires a lot of detailed analysis, and there is something to do with money or value or self-worth in it, don't be rushed by anyone else's desire to push you to get it to work to their schedule and timeline. It's very, very important to you. Once Mars moves back into your 7th house in the middle of April, you'll have so much more information to make the informed choices you need to have around how you can connect to others. This will be particularly so in terms of a job or work situation. But if you have been finding it a little bit difficult to get the sleep you need, you have had an excess of nervous energy, you have found yourself a bit wired up, wouldn't be a surprise with the Mars retrograde. I think things can ease a little bit, but just be aware with the moon, as Mars goes direct in your 12th house, your subconscious, the psychological part of our nature, so powerful when it comes to how much energy and vitality we have. So if you have got some ailments which do seem to be rather stubborn to move, do think about what it may be that's informing some of the responses physically that you're experiencing. So Pisces, for you, when Mars moved into your 5th house in the early part of September, that gave you a glorious opportunity for 2 months to be much more interactive, playful, social, showcase your talents, creativity, flair, and undoubted charisma. It's just that Saturn in your sign has been a little like a leadened influence, and whatever you've wanted to showcase in a very dynamic, glittering way, Saturn has been somehow slowing the process down. Then of course Mars moved into your 6th house, which meant if there had been something that you've been developing that is very gifted, that gave you the thrust to be more productive. But then when Mars slammed on the brakes on the 6th of December, you may have found pretty well from then round to now that it's been much more difficult to manifest what's so important to you. Keep the faith. It is true that with the moon in an opposition with Mars, you have to be conscious, particularly around your social, romantic world, of the balance that you need to strike between what you need to do for you, Mars in the 5th house, but also where you need to connect to others, but also be conscious what your future plans are and why you need to keep to your big plan and not get knocked off course by short-term issues. So through to the middle of April, I think it can be a more playful, more social time, but you have to work with that very restrictive energies of Saturn, which is not easy at all. And particularly with the North Node and also Neptune aligning in your sign, that's a very spiritual dimension, but we got some heavyweight eclipses come in through the signs of Virgo and Pisces this year, and that suggests there is going to be some juggle between what you need and where you connect to others. But I feel that Mars going direct, perhaps more than any other zodiac sign, does give you the optimism that something can be stepping up there's a higher frequency coming, but you must use the energy you've got in a very selective way and target it strictly towards the areas that are really important. So don't scatter yourself too thinly, and make sure you prioritize your approach. It's been a real pleasure being with you for this Mars Stationing Direct special. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do check out my new website at www.patrickarundell.com.